Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams, Dancing in the Family and Intergenerational Memoir. Joining us today are Sukanya Rahman, who will be in conversation with Ranjana Dave. Before I hand over to Ranjana, if you are here for the first time and are not signed up to our mailing list, you can do so by visiting our website, or you can follow us on our social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. With that, thank you so much, Sukanya and Ranjana, for doing this for us, and welcome everyone.
Thanks.
I start with a quick video, and then we proceed to the conversation.
Was our family religion. When my grandmother Ragini Devi did something grandmotherly, like take me to the circus, she would embarrass me by demonstrating Bharatanatyam adavus along the sidewalk. My architect father complained that his dance career was overshadowed by my mother's, and my Indian grandfather, Ragini's estranged husband, would write to me regularly from New York, urging me not to become a dancer. This family obsession with dance traces its roots to the early 1920s, when my grandmother, a Midwesterner from Minneapolis, believed she was a Hindu in a previous life. She gave herself a new incarnation as a high-caste Kashmiri Brahmin and convinced New York audiences she had been taught invisible dances in secret sanctuaries by the lamas of Tibet and India. A passion for genuine classical Indian dance took her to Kerala, where she became instrumental in introducing the then little-known Kathakali to the rest of India and the world. Indrani, on advice from her mother, first specialized in Bharatanatyam, and then lesser-known dance forms such as Mohiniyattam and Kuchipudi. She was a pioneer in the revival of Odissi, and the first to present it in the US and internationally. I did not heed my grandfather's urgings and was swept into the family tradition of dance. Ragini, after a stay of 50+ years in India, returned to New York in 1978. Coming full circle, her last appearance in New York in 1979, at the age of 85, was at a performance of our 3 generations of dancers. In acknowledging the standing ovation at the end by a packed audience and scores of prominent American dance figures, she announced, "This concert is the climax of my life, which is drawing to a close. I'm happy to see the pure tradition safeguarded by my daughter Indrani and my granddaughter Sukanya."
Thank you, Raghu, for that. And hello to everyone who's joined us today. Our conversation today draws on Dancing in the Family, the book that Sukanya has written. And I thought that it might be useful to bring a few things up before we dive into this conversation. Not to summarize the book necessarily, but really to draw from it the contours of our discussion today. Dancing in the Family follows 3 generations of dancers. Ragini Devi, who was born Esther Sherman, Sukanya's grandmother, Indrani Rahman, her mother, and finally Sukanya herself. It is an intimate memoir chronicling not just their lives in dance, but also the circumstances that shaped those lives in particular ways. Unfolding over the course of the 20th century, these stories intersect with the Indian independence movement and also the first few decades post-independence, right after 1947. In these decades, from what we sort of know of dance history, and dance history particularly shaped around New Delhi, what's most popularly in public circulations of these years is very fragmented. There's mentions of a dance competition in 1954, a Sangeet Natak Academy seminar in 1958, a Marg issue in 1960. I find that Dancing in the Family almost begins to populate a small part of that history. It inserts people into details. It elaborates on their lives in public and private spaces. telling us what was performed, but also letting us know how the dancers got there. I find it valuable to revisit that time now with a deeper sense of how it's ended up shaping ideas of culture in India, what this culture was, and also who got to perform it. And perhaps our conversation today will focus on some of that. The format of our discussion will be as follows. I have a few questions for Sukanya that are very open-ended and mainly meant to serve as mooring points in the conversation. We will take questions from the audience. Gosh, it feels surreal to say audience on Zoom, but we will take questions from the audience in the last 25 to 30 minutes of the conversation. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was leading off from what I just said, this idea of the public and the private. And there's a way in which your book becomes an account of both these spaces, of the domestic and of the staged. One instance that stays with me is your account of your mother going to great lengths to hide her pregnancy, so it wouldn't affect her work prospects. How have you negotiated this, training and performing with your family and also growing up with them, with dancing almost bleeding into your life, as you say in your clip when you talk about your grandmother taking you to the circus but beginning to demonstrate a step? What does it mean to balance a personal life with a life on stage?
Well, Ranjana, great question, loaded question. You know, as I said, our home was a dance and arts madhouse. There was, the house was always filled with musicians, accompanists, my mother performing, rehearsing in the house. So it was, you know, professional and personal were completely intermingled. There was really no difference. I never felt any pressure to take classes or dance or anything. But right from the beginning, my grandmother, Ragini, she was actually my first teacher, my first Bharatanatyam teacher. And in turn, she had guided my mother. And then my mother guided me. She also taught me. And we did these, and some of the things she taught me, I had complete items sent by mail with her drawings. And then later on, the cassettes would come. And by the time we got to do a rehearsal with the musicians, you know, before a performance, for instance, in New York, the musicians would be astounded that we could both dance together to the music just from notes. So there was all kinds of ways of learning, and so dance. And my father was also, he was an architect, but he also danced, and he did a fabulous takeoff, you know, not in fun, but very seriously, of Martha Graham, and whom I eventually went to study with because of being inspired by him. And his performances were in the drawing room after a party, you know, after several whiskey sodas, etc. So that was our life. And then I got married to Frank Wicks, my husband, who ended up doing our lights and music and was, you know, my mother's impresario. So really there was no difference for me personally between the public and private life. It was all one.
You also you also write a lot about the spaces in which your life unfolded, about the travel. There are very elaborate Calcutta, Delhi, and also formed your experience? Who were the teachers that you, from the book, and perhaps this is also, maybe if we could recount some of that for the sake of this conversation, the teachers, because you traveled with your mother as she was learning many of these new dance styles in the 40s and 50s. So what were the spaces you went to? Who were the teachers you encountered? And what was that experience like?
Well, that, well, Bangalore was very much a part of it. My mother, when she came to India the second time, after she got married to my father in Calcutta, it was, 1946, 1947. It was during the riots, the communal riots, and the Bharatanatyam teachers had fled the city. So she began by studying Kathak. There was, I'm losing all the names and things. The teacher, Sukdev Maharaj, and he would come to our home and teach, and it was quite an astonishing experience to watch him. Then we had people like Gopi Krishna, Sitara Devi, all, in the house. And it was when my mother saw Shanta Rao perform in Calcutta, she was inspired to, decided to specialize in Bharatanatyam. And she approached Shanta, and Shanta said, no, with your young baby, it's not practical to go to a village, which was then Pandanallur, where she had studied. And that at that time, my grandmother arrived from New York and took control of my mother's training and packed her off to Bangalore. So, and before that, my mother and grandmother had come to Bangalore when my mother was 2 months old, and in the 1930s, and they ended up at the Theosophical Center at the invitation of Venkatachalam, who was very much a figure in the arts in India anyway. And then she came to Bangalore, and she was studying with Krishna Rao and Chandama, and actually had her debut performance in 1949, a private performance in the reception hall of St. John Street, at the Theosophical Center. So that sort of continued, and I was there. I celebrated my 3rd birthday in Bangalore. So there was quite a connection. And years later, while we had been performing, she had been teaching me, she sent me to her gurus, a Pandanallur guru, then to Deva Prasad Das and Raja Reddy, and continued. And then I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, a tiny little grant. And at the urging of, I think Ram Gopal had suggested to my mother, I go and study with Kittappa in Bangalore. So I returned as a grown woman to study with Kittappa. And I wanted to have that experience of working, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week with a guru in the old-fashioned style. And it was a wonderful experience. And he took me to his home in Tanjore, right? It was attached to the Brihadishwara temple. And I performed there in front of his altar, with the figure of Krishna, and there were clothes hanging around laundry hanging, cows coming in and out. And that sort of, I understood then what dance really was. And also had this, we were instilled by my mother, both my brother and I, that to watch a performance, we should, a fine performance should make us tremble, break out in goose flesh and weep. And that was a sign. She said, if you're in a performance and you weep and have those reactions, you're watching a great artist. So this was with us all the time. And both she and my grandmother had no room for any mediocrity. So these were really the values that were instilled to us, and also a guide to, how we watch dance, the arts, and what affects us. And it's remained with me always. I hope this helps answer some of your questions.
Your mother learned and performed multiple styles of dance and often moved between them in the course of a single evening of performance. That's not seen as often now. I mean, dancers don't do that much. And also with the boundaries between forms becoming more consolidated and dancers effectively specializing in one form, how did your mother work, sort of negotiate training in different styles and performing them? And were there possibilities of ideas of any cross-pollination between forms? When I know that she often went on tour with several of her teachers, her Odissi teacher, her Kuchipudi teacher, and so on. So was there any cross-pollination between these forms, ideas being exchanged when she performed multiple forms in the same performance?
Absolutely not. She started off with Bharatanatyam, and at a time when it was still not, in North India, it was not that well known. And she did full Bharatanatyam performances for many, many years, solo Bharatanatyam performances. And then she got restless with Bharatanatyam. So instead of innovating within Bharatanatyam, and also at the suggestion of her mother, she began to explore other forms, like Mohiniyattam, Kuchipudi, Odissi, of course, and even Satriya dance from Assam. And so this was her way of, satisfying the restlessness with one tradition, but they remained completely separate and never cross-pollinated or innovated in that sense. So she was a complete traditionalist. And the time when she, was bringing her troupe, bringing dance out of India, not much was known about the classical dances. And this was an opportunity for people to see different styles. Odissi, Kuchipudi, it was all completely new. And I think that for her, that had some value of introducing. And she felt, after doing these pieces, different pieces, the audiences were they're now able, even in Europe and in the States, audiences now are able to take an entire evening of Kathak, an entire evening of Bharatanatyam, Kathakali. Even though those were shortened Kathakali, I was always taken to all-night performances. So that was also something, behind her thought of also keeping these styles absolutely separate.
But I'm going to dwell on that question a little longer. What does it mean for the body, literally, to be switching between styles? Because it's a huge, they're also, they're also systems of thinking almost. And
right.
Each of them, I mean, Odissi, for instance, draws on the ethos of that place. And many of the, I mean, of course, I think that's changing now, but much of the movement was really had connections to, say, gestures that were part of daily life in a particular context. So what does it mean for the body then to switch between these styles? How did your mother deal with that? Just as a dancer, as a human being.
Maybe that was a part of some of her genius, and my grandmother also, did different styles. She studied the Mysore Bharatanatyam, and then she got very interested in Kathakali. So, and I myself, I wanted to break away from these traditions, and I went to New York, as I said, and I studied with Martha Graham, modern dance, American modern dance. And I realized in watching her that she had already drawn a lot from Asian styles and Indian styles. And I got a lot from her in terms of, just standing, how to stand. And that never, crept into my work. And I also tried to keep the styles separate. It never really struck us, we never thought about it. They were such fabulous gurus and dancers who demonstrated. Deva Prasad Das was an exquisite dancer, as was Korada Narasimha Rao, and who taught my mother Kuchipudi. So, the styles really stayed separate. I think we have the gurus to thank for that.
I was at some point when I think when you're in Puri with your mother, there's a brief, you talk about visiting the house of a Mahari and
right.
Watching the Maharis dance. This time, the 40s and the 50s are also, it's also a time when a certain sort of the, community of hereditary performers, of some courtesans are moving away from these forms, and there's also a new kind of dancer beginning to sort of appear in the public eye. So while you were traveling the country and learning these dance styles, what were your interactions? I wonder if you could go into a little more detail about the sort of the dancers from hereditary backgrounds that you may have met.
Well, actually, my mother was, I didn't go with my mother when she went to the Mahari's house. Her guru, Debu, took her. But my connection with that was at a tea party at I think it was the governor of Puri, his house. His wife and her lady friends gave a tea party to meet this Mahari. And my mother wanted to meet her. And I think that was before she went to see her perform. And this dancer, she stood by the door and was not invited in to meet the other dancers. So there was a stigma at that time, that she wouldn't be allowed. And even at a very young age, I was quite horrified by that. Seeing that this woman was a dancer, and then she didn't want to get too much publicity as a dancer because she was trying to train as a nurse, which she thought would be more respectable. So it was quite a while later that they became, actual teachers, and they hung up certificates in their house. My mother had to write a certificate stating that this dancer she saw was a classical dancer doing beautiful traditional work. And of course, Odissi, what the Maharis were doing was a little different from what was then taught. And what we were taught by Debu was much, he had a great, he was a Gotipur originally, and he had a great sense, there was something folk in his dancing, a little bit of chow or something, which was the beauty of his art. And we discovered, and my mother also felt very much over the years that that form of Odissi became completely diluted. And that was really mixed. There was a lot of Bharatanatyam put in at that point. Many dancers went to Kalakshetra to train, and then they came back, and it was different. And the Odissi I see now, and even in my mother's time, was very, very different from what she was taught and what she danced. And many years later, I went back to Bhuvaneshwar, and my guru was there, and I performed. And afterwards, some of the old senior dancers came backstage and said, "Oh, that your performance was an anachronism," And I don't know if she meant it as a compliment or as a criticism, but I took it as a compliment. So those, the later dancers, as younger dancers, kept absorbing other techniques. They wanted it to be faster and more rhythmic and more complicated footwork. And then the Sanchari Bhava came in, which really didn't exist a lot in Odissi. It was much simpler form. And later on, even now, you see, a lot of Sanchari Bhava continuing on stage, even when there's no sahitya, just to instrumental music or alap or something. So these were the changes, and the changes now that we all see. There were two completely different times of dance, and who knows what it'll evolve into eventually, if it'll be like this or go into something else. I myself hesitate to go to a lot of performances. I love to watch, one of the dancers, though it was dance theater, Kudiyatam. I wept when I saw this woman, Kapila Venu, perform. And she did a Narasimha, Hiranyakashipu, and then changing from Vishnu into Narasimha. And she was almost foaming at the mouth. And I really wept at seeing her. And another dancer that I've enjoyed watching and who's moved me to tears is Aniruddha, Bala's grandson. And he's kept in that tradition, and there's something very beautiful about his work. I was at Triveni last March, waiting to meet with Kavita. And on stage was a group of chow dancers having a rehearsal with their drums. And it was astounding and so refreshing to see something like that, other than the usual Bharatanatyam, Odissi, whatever's happening now. I'm probably digressing, but these memories come back to me. The beautiful memories of performances.
But to just sort of push that point a little bit, I also wonder, given the legacy of your family and your grandmom, for instance, who in much of her early work literally sort of there's creative license taken with, and there's so much imagination. There's all these sort of stories, these performances coming out of her imagination. So would you then say that somewhere it is necessary that tradition shouldn't actually sort of, ossify at a particular point? I think definitely in terms of public memory and in terms of what we have access to also visually, from the 50s onwards, we have most of our documentation comes from the 30s, 40s, and especially in terms of classical dance as it is understood now, the 50s. But I'm guessing those forms also kept changing before that moment in time, and as you say, they've continued to after that moment in time. So I just wonder what the role of individual interpretation then, just curiosity of artists sort of making decisions about the forms they engage with. And these are forms that I think, they're forms they engage with over years and years and years. And what authorship does that give you almost, I wonder?
Well, I think you're talking about the 40s and 50s. And, all the dancers then were highly individualistic. Shanta or Bala or Vaijanti Mala, beautiful, beautiful dancers. The costumes were all different. The way of dancing was different. Shanta had a completely individualistic style. Bala had an individualistic style. And innovations, I'm sure, they had also grown, their growth was different from what they might have studied. In Ragini's case, she was in Kalamandalam studying Kathakali, and got together with, partnered with Gopinath, and formed a small company with him. And she decided to do very shortened versions of Kathakali and also simplify the costume. And at first the Brantans were horrified, and then they saw that she's taking the dance out of Kerala for the first time. And, that helped. And then, in later years, in London, in New York, even I saw full-length performances of Kathakali in full costume. And, this was a way of getting people interested and then understanding it more. So, I think it can get completely bogged down with theories and seminars and, experts talking about what the dance should be and shouldn't be. And, there's sort of a natural flowing sometimes is missing, with all these standards put in. And I don't know if that makes sense.
I thought this would be a good time to just sort of go to that clip of Mandodari Shabdam. Sukanya, is there anything you'd like to say about the clip before we start playing it?
Well, this was filmed in Los Angeles for the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. And it was during the festival, Ravi Shankar's Festival of India. And that's, you know, this was Hollywood. And that's, I don't know what more I can say, but.
Thank you. I'm just going to play it now.
Indrani is one of the finest dancers from India. She is well known for the ancient classical form Bharatanatyam. She also dances other styles. Tonight she will perform the legend of the frog maiden in the style known as Kuchipudi, which was composed in the 12th century. Ladies and gentlemen, Indrani.
The dance begins showing the frog dancing. In the waters of the pond, the frog. The darting fish. The slow tortoise. Crabs. On the dancing ripples of the pond, lotuses, bees hovering over the lotuses. The frog dives to the bottom of the pond and is transformed into the beautiful frog maiden Mandodari. Bejeweled and radiant. She rises from the pond, glides with the grace of a swan. Mandodari. Face like a lotus, like a deer, her eyes. The mood changes to depict Ravana, the demon king. Powerful and arrogant. Demon King, Frog Maiden. the beautiful Mandodari, seeing her, pierced by the arrows of Cupid, the demon king falls in love with her. The demon king, Mandodari. He takes her and carries her off to his kingdom to be his queen.
My final question for you is a slightly long question again. Working across cultures, both your mother and your grandmother almost began to self-fashion identities for themselves, defining who they wanted to be in dance. I can't help but think in terms of our current context, where we increasingly find that the state is pushing very sort of restrictive ideas of what it means to be Indian. It's imposing these ideas on citizens, on what it means to be Indian, what it means to, what citizenship means, what it means to be patriotic even. Having lived through the former, having sort of, you've seen your mother, your grandmother, you've lived that life, and you're also witnessing what's happening now, what's unfolding now in India. What do you make of the changing nature of classical dance? Because this also begins to affect this idea of what is Indian, what Indian classical dance should look like. Also, all these sort of ideas of nationalism also begin to seep into classical dance. So what do you make of this changing nature of dance?
Well, I really haven't kept up much with the current dance scene. As I said, you know, really on purpose, because I had grown up seeing, you know, just completely being infused with dance and beautiful performances all the time. Just from my personal background, you know, my mother was half American. Her father was Brahmin Maharashtrian. She married a Muslim from Calcutta, a family that was very conservative Muslim, and who accepted all this in the middle of, you know, riots in the city, in the middle of partition. There was no question about Hindu, Muslim, or anything. And now it seems to have obviously been taken over with the political situation. And, you know, which I think is too bad. And you know, it's personal, my personal opinion, that, and I don't know if, you know, the dancers themselves feel they should stick to certain guidelines. Maybe this is something you would know more about and tell me, but I think, you know, it should be two separate things. The arts and politics completely different. But that's not the way it is now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, if sort of living in the world that we do, we have the choice anymore to be able to keep those things separate. And I don't know if that choice, for myself, I don't know if that choice has ever existed. So there is definitely what we do as artists is also political. And I think it's political both in how the sort of state views it and how we view it at the moment. And perhaps some of this will also come up in the discussions that we have with the people attending, people who are part of this conversation. I'm just going to move into the questions now.
I just wanted to make one remark on the video that was just played, and to the accompanying, the vocalist Anur Surya Narayan and the flutist Srinivasa Murthy had been with my mother for a long time, and both were from Bangalore. And many of her musicians, including Krishna Pillai, who's, they're all gone now, were from Bangalore. So.
And you're playing the Tanpura in that.
I'm playing the Tanpura. And with someone there was a man sitting next to me in the audience when we were viewing all this. And he turned to me and said, that's such a complicated instrument you're playing. And I thought, it's really a simple instrument. And then I asked someone who this person was, interested in the music. And it was the singer Glen Campbell, who I don't know if people know, but he was a popular country singer who was sitting there watching this. Anyway, it's out of the context, but it was an interesting episode to see. And my husband was backstage doing his own version of Manduka Shabdam.
I'm going to start. The first question, I think perhaps I'm going to combine the first and second question by Sachdev Ramakrishna. He asks about your family's connection with Ravi Shankar, and also asks how, he says that in your personal lives over 3 generations, you threw convention out of the window while you accepted the conservatism and rigors of learning a variety of dance forms. How do you explain this paradox?
Well, those are 2 questions. Ravi Shankar, well, his brother was Uday Shankar, a dancer, well known to my grandmother. And Ravi Shankar has known our family since I was a baby, and has always been a close friend and, associate also. And it was, he had also, my first publishers, when my book was first launched, my editor, Renuka Chatterjee, asked if I could find a celebrity to, do a book launch. And I thought, I don't know. She said, can you ask Ravi Shankar to do it? And I heard then that he was not feeling well. He was in Delhi and had not been well. But I picked up the phone anyway and called him. And I said, I've been asked by my publishers to ask you and, forgive me. And he said, I'm right in the middle of reading your book. And I would absolutely love to introduce your book. And he spent a long time at the opening, at the launch of my book. And he brought into, the very early history of the family, visiting, his brother and him visiting our family home in Calcutta. a Muslim family home in Calcutta. And so our connections run deep. And when I was a student in Paris, he was there, he would call me often, invite me to see a Beatles movie, or, take me out to lunch and things. And when he married Sukanya, my mother got phone calls saying, "Oh, Ravi Shankar is now your son-in-law." And she would get furious because she was much younger than Ravi Shankar and didn't want to be known as his mother-in-law. So, it was wonderful, wonderful associations with Ravi. And I'm trying to think of the second half of the question. What was?
Yes, it was about, let me see if there's a way, does that make the question show up? I clicked on something that says answer live. Okay.
No, you can just read it out, yeah.
Okay, I should just read it out. Still learning Zoom. The question says, in your personal lives over 3 generations, you threw convention out of the window while accepting the conservatism and rigors of learning a variety of dance forms. How do you explain this paradox?
I think this is something any artist would go through, living life the way they want to, and still adhering strictly to, whether they're opera singers or painters or artists. Their lives are, they probably become artists because they have ingrained freedom within them, freedom of expression. And I think it goes together with, you can talk to many artists and they have unconventional lives, adventurous lives, messy lives. But that doesn't stop one from, pursuing one's art, to the full extent. I hope that answers this question.
There's another question about, was there a dance form that each of you preferred more than the others between the forms that you trained in?
Well, for me, personally, it was Odissi, mainly because I felt comfortable performing it. I also loved Kuchipudi for the drama and things. And I had most difficulty with Bharatanatyam. I just didn't feel, it was my strength. But it was valuable training in it. A little bit of Mohiniyattam. I'm not sure with my mother. I think she was also comfortable. I think she was very comfortable in all the styles. But later on, she was performing less Bharatanatyam and more Odissi and Kuchipudi. So I don't know if it was a preference or what, but
the next question. And just to maybe, before I go on to the question, just a reminder to everyone who's attending, please leave your questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box. The question is about your dance. And Srinivas Murthy asks, what kinds of influences did you, in dance, did you get from your father, who was also a renowned architect? And also, did your mother and father influence each other in their respective fields?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. It was all always conversations and criticisms, strong criticisms, good criticisms. my parents were both extremely opinionated and expressed their opinions freely. And my father, I think, was a good judge of dance. And he also took a lot of the dance photographs of my mother and myself. And, but he really very much wanted me to be a visual artist, because he felt that for a person like, I was very calm, and he thought dance would be too hectic career for me. And so I think I got a lot of, what I got from him was mostly in my artwork, inspiration from his drawings and things. Whenever he would send me if I'm not there, he would send me a birthday card or something. It was always with his drawings. He never sent a store-bought card or something. So that really was my strong connection with my father.
To that, I'd like to add a question of my own. There's this, what is this with, you start that you do at the very beginning. It starts from, I was saying that clip that we viewed at the very beginning, it starts by saying that your grandfather also constantly wrote to you and asked you not to become a dancer.
Right.
So what was his reluctance? All the men in the family seemed to have some sort of,
His reluctance was my grandmother. She took to dance and ran away from him. And dance was her whole life. And he would really rather have had a domestic housewife instead of a dancer. So he was very much, it was really to do with my grandmother dancing. He didn't feel I should become like her. She was a complete free soul.
Okay. So,
yes.
Our next question is from Samita. She asks, she says, having come from an interracial background, did you or your family have to negotiate experiences of belonging to both the East and the West, to being insiders and outsiders in both contexts?
Not at all. Not at all. We never thought about it. It was something we still just take for granted. No boundaries.
But for instance, if I may add to that, I remember you described your mother touring the South with her musicians in the 60s and having to deal with segregated bathrooms and with not being served at restaurants and all those. So what, there is a way in which, and increasingly now there's a lot of conversation about about class in India, about Dalit lives, and also about Dalit Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA. So, so how did these things then? I'm sure these were things that got discussed. For instance, the musicians having to confront not being served or being treated differently in a different cultural context.
Right. Well, those things seem to have not changed at all, even today in the US, with what's going on now with Black Lives Matter and things. And their reaction, my mother's reaction to it was completely, you've invited us to perform in this town. There were 2 cities, and she just canceled the performances and refused to perform. That's all. So it was a shock. And it was at the same time that she had just performed for at Nehru's invitation in Washington for President Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy and his family. So it was, you know, quite a contrast, the two things happening at the same time. And she never went back to the South. Yeah. I know when the musicians asked her, you know, which bathroom they should use, you know, the whites and the coloreds and all, she said, just do everything on the sign.
Someone asked if there's any video of you dancing, I'm guessing.
A little bit, yes, but you know, fewer, and also of my mother, very few videos and films, mostly because when we were performing, we discouraged people taking videos of the performance. So unfortunately, but there are some videos, and you know, dance on video doesn't always look fabulous, but I do have some videos.
There's a question about your grandmother. How did your grandmother get such an impossible Indianness in her?
Well, people have been asking her that question forever. And she genuinely believed she was an Indian in a past life. Absolutely. And it's incongruous. You know, she was from Minneapolis, from, you know, middle class, white, Christian family, and just had this burning desire to dance. She started off with, you know, experimenting in, she was doing sort of Russian tea dances and exotic dances, Spanish dances, and then in, you know, when my grandfather arrived in Minneapolis amongst other Indians who had fled India during the independence movement, because he had desecrated two statues of Queen Victoria, and in Nagpur, and threw her in a pond. And then someone, you know, ratted on him and on his compatriots, and he had to flee the city. And so they were sent to Japan, and from there they was sent to Minneapolis, a group, you know, this group of, they had a price on their head for treason. And so these, they were mostly men who were enrolled in the university and to study, and they were all studying chemistry, because these were pre-Gandhian revolutionaries, and they were studying chemistry so they would know how to make bombs. And so Ragini got wind of this crowd, and she was at the university and started befriending them and, you know, getting to know their music, their culture, their food. And then she fell in love with Ramlal Bajpai. And then she had a professor who was coaching her, helping her understand the Natya Shastras, which was in the library. And so she began by making up her own dances, and married and moved to New York, and literally completely transformed herself. She only wore saris. She would always have a tilak. She would rub, you know, Indian mud, which was a kind of clay, on her face to look darker. and passed herself off as an Indian, and would often deny being American. As I said in the clip, she passed herself off as a Kashmiri Brahmin. But she really felt she was in some earlier incarnation. She was an Indian.
Are there any final questions? Just wait to see if any questions. I was also sort of thinking about this, about what it means to be Indian, in connection to what we were speaking about earlier, the state side of what it means to be Indian right now, and how these ideas of Indianness, just as the forms themselves, keep shifting with time.
It's something I've never thought about, you know. I've always felt completely Indian, and I've lived in many places. I've lived in France, in Paris for many years, and then in New York, and now in Maine, which is really very different from New York. But I've just never had a problem with identity. I'm Indian. I think my two sons, when they were younger, in their school, they felt some stigma, and when I heard that my oldest son was hurt about it, I just called the parents of the child and screamed at them, you know, for being so stupid, and you know. But I think for my kids in the beginning, it was you know, as school children, you know, being in a completely white environment, though they're half American, you know, and half Indian, but they were in a completely white school. So that was interesting. And when I performed, I was performing a lot. I had a special grant to perform in schools and colleges and things in Maine, and I was invited to perform at my son's school. And of course, I went in the morning and did, you know, with full costume and everything, and performed. And the students loved it. They had lots of questions, and gave me a very enthusiastic applause at the end and things. And when I went back home at night, we were having dinner, and they turned to me and said, "Ma, don't you ever do that again. Don't you ever come to our school dressed like that again." And of course, I obeyed them. I didn't want to hurt them anymore. And then many years later, they were a little older. My son was in college, and they both came to a performance that I did in Maine. And my son came backstage afterwards and said, "Ma, can you come to our college and do a performance for us?" And I was shocked. You know, after that first reaction as children, they suddenly come and they want to show me to their peer. And I was very moved by that, and surprised by that. And at the end of the concert, he came up on stage and presented me a bouquet of flowers in front of all the other students. And I went off stage then, and I, announced to my husband, who was doing the lights and everything, I said, that was my last concert, because it meant so much for me to be appreciated by my children, you know, after what they'd gone through. So I think this should answer your question. I don't know. I mean, is there, this is my question, is there more of a closed-mindedness about everything now in India? You know, I grew up in such a freer time, and of course I was younger, and, you know, problems weren't that heavyweight on kids. But I think all that has changed now.
A close-mindedness in what way?
In every way. I mean, we're talking about the Dalits and the, you know, you asked about dancers, you know, having to do things in a certain way. And, you know, it was never like that.
With classical dance, and I mean, there are lots of, I see a lot of dancers among the attendees as well, and maybe they can chime in. The Q&A box can also be used to add comments. There is definitely a closed-mindedness, and it sort of trickles down from a sort of wider socio-political landscape, so to say. But I feel like there's also an increased, right now, and increased consciousness of the entire ecology, because even in terms of history, in what is available to us, there is only a very particular history that is made available. Like a lot of the history of classical dances in India is so Sangeet Natak Academy centric, so Delhi centric, that we hear very little about other places and other people who are essentially invisibilized. So I feel like there's definitely a little more awareness of what else is happening, and of the things that we've deliberately sort of hidden and erased from that history over time. And while that definitely, it makes things harder to speak about in many ways, I feel like it, but it's also a very useful addition to know it's not as easily explicable any longer. You can't sift things into categories in the same ways any longer. But I feel like that's a productive, that's really a productive development, so to say. I feel like it's useful to be able to complicate things, to think of things in more complex ways, to realize that certain things have been visible, certain things are invisible, and that all of these hold each other up in an ecology of sorts. Yeah, that's all I'd like to say. To conclude, maybe if we could just, and maybe this question also connects to what I was just saying. For someone reading the book, reading Dancing in the Family now, how would you like them to approach the book, given the context that they're reading this from in the moment?
You know, I didn't set out to write a book on the history of dance. It was very much grew out from my family experience. I didn't want to deify either my mother or my grandmother. I wanted to present them as, you know, flesh and blood human beings with all their great talents and their flaws. I had the first publisher who accepted my book was a university press in the US. And I was, they were trying for me to turn my book into a complete academic text, you know, and add my grandmother's first book, Nritanjali, to it. And it turned very complicated. And I was on the phone in my mother's apartment in New York, and she heard me speaking to this person and all the arguments back and forth. And when I put the phone down, my mother turned to me and said, "Don't listen to any of these people. You know, this has to be your story, and you have to write exactly what you want." Her only beef was that I wouldn't let her read my book. I wouldn't let her read my manuscript while I was working on it. And she was very upset. And her good friend was Ruth Chabwala, the writer. And my mother complained to her. She said, "Oh, you know, Baby," I was called Baby, "won't let me read her manuscript. And, you know, I feel very offended." And Ruth turned to her and said, "You know, no family should read a book that's being worked on for the family." And so that calmed my mother down, and she understood, you know, coming from a writer like Ruth saying that, she calmed down. But really it was, and one of the motives for my book was also to chronicle for my children, you know, their history. And I thought they have a rather unusual history from what, you know, our family has been involved in. So it was really, you know, for them to bring that out and for them to keep. And now I've sent copies of my book to my grandchildren. And my granddaughter, I got a message from her the other day expressing interest in wanting to study dance. So I feel, you know, a little seed has been planted. Not that I would force her to become a dancer or anything, but it's, you know, I was very moved by having that reaction that she wanted to learn from me. So, you know, that's what my book is about.
Thank you. I'm just going to loop into one last question that we received as you were speaking, and maybe we can end with that. This actually, I think this loops back to what you were, the question you asked me about things becoming sort of more close-minded. And actually, I'm not sure if it's more of a comment. Samita says that, would like to say that whether things were more free 60 years ago, perhaps really depended on who you were as a dancer. A hereditary dancer definitely was stigmatized, as you also express in the instance of the Mahari that you met.
Sure.
Even Rukmini Devi wasn't able to step onto stage without putting up a big fight, even within the Theosophical Society. Yeah, to that, and in somewhere in my asking you this question about how one reads the book today, it's also a question of how, I mean, even the things that happen and the things that we chronicle, how do, where we stand in relation to them, how does that change with time somewhere? Yeah.
Well, you know, you go back to the early 1920s and, you know, where dance was completely ostracized and even banned in the temples and things. And it was gradually, you know, with people like Anna Pavlova, who toured the country and opened the eyes of a lot of Britishers, but even Indians were closed-minded then about dance and people performing on stage and things. And so we have come a long way. And I think Ragini was very much came into the scene at that time. And, you know, was one of the motivators in helping change that attitude. And then even, you know, Gandhi's support of women, women's rights and things also opened up the dance scene. And I think it'll forever be evolving, and opinions changing, and the mindset changing. And I think it'll keep changing. Don't you think so?
Yes, definitely. I feel like this, as all conversations go, this one also, I mean, there's so much more that we can talk about, but we have a deadline. So, we should conclude here. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I'm losing some of your audio.
I said no. We're nearly at the 8:30 mark. So I was saying these are conversations that can go on, and
Sure.
And I feel like they're actually they are long conversations, and hopefully they're conversations we can keep having over time. And thank you, Sukanya, for this conversation. Thank you, BIC, and thank you to all the participants who've sent us questions. Over to Raghu now.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ranjana and Raghu.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sukanya, for opening a door to a lesser known slice of cultural and performance history that so many of us have immensely enjoyed discovering. Thank you so much, Ranjana, for doing this conversation. Thank you, our audiences, for joining us